Hello, YouTube. Get that orange flavored Skittles drink mix. My name's Gabe. I am one third of the Spine Crackers podcast, which is the eponymous podcast of the channel that you're currently watching. Myself and the other two members of the show, hosts of the show, Paul and Matt, are going to be uploading some more YouTube content in the coming weeks, months, years, decades, centuries, depending on where human biological science takes us. And this review that I'm going to do is going to be a short story review. It's the second story from a collection, The Living Are Few, the Dead Many, by German author Henny Jahnn. The first review that I did from this collection of the story Kabad Kenya is up on our Patreon page, which is patreon.com/spinecrackers. And I will be going through the rest of this text over the next few weeks and doing reviews of the other two stories in it, another short story and a longer novella. If you did see the Patreon review, I actually I spoke about how this was sort of the only seemingly legitimate English translations that I've been able to find of John's works. But I was mistaken in that review, and I have since then been able to track down a digital copy of an academic translation of the full text of Henny Jahn's 13 Uncanny Tales, which does include the 3 short stories included in this collection and 10 others. So this series may actually go on quite a bit longer than I had initially anticipated, because I was originally only planning to do these 4 stories. I also have realized or discovered that there is apparently a real sort of legitimate English translation of the first novel in John's unfinished trilogy, A River Without Banks, which in the English is translated as The Ship. I may try to get my hands on that at some point to review, but we'll see. It's a little bit trickier to nail down. If you want to know a little bit about, I talk about John's background in the first review, again, up on the Patreon, and I talk a little bit about my own interest in his work, which is a sort of an interesting kind of childhood story that piques my interest. Childhood, 13 or 14, early teenage years, that piqued my interest in John, but I had never been able to find his work in translation until I bought this. I think this came out in 2013 or something, 2014, 2012. And so I was very excited when I finally bought it. And yeah. So the story we're reviewing today is called Sassanid King. And it's a short story. It's only about 20 pages. Not a difficult read per se. Well, that's actually entirely false. It's an extremely difficult read. The story is ostensibly a sort of historical fiction about a Sassanid emperor, which is a sort of pre-Iranian Persian empire that existed in the 5 to 600s range. I have not, full disclosure, I am not an expert in this time period in history, and John clearly did an insane amount of research before writing this story. There are so many historical names and places and concepts. He uses some plants, ancient plants that they used for various things in Persia at the time. He goes so far as to include contemporaneous, specific, now outdated units of measurement to describe how far towns are from each other and things like that. So it's a very, very thoroughly researched historical piece of work. You can just look at the words that I circled on the first page. Most of those are names or places that I had to look up. And at first I was sort of, it's difficult because the translations, or the translations from the ancient Arabic, I don't even know if that was the right language, but the Persian to uh, the German and the English in his time are not the same, are not exactly the same as the translations that are used now. So even Googling some of the names, I wasn't coming up with anything originally, and I kind of had to dig to see what names were real and which ones he may have made up. And it looks like on some reflection that almost everything in here is real. There were a few things that I wasn't able to identify based on the words he was using, but it seems like this is basically a true to history account of the Persian Emperor Khosrau II, or Khosrau Parviz. In the text, and this is just a small example of what I was sort of talking about. In the text, it's spelled Khasrau, and the accepted translation now is Khosrow. So it's just little things like that made checking up on some of this stuff difficult. And I have an entire window I wish I could show you, but I'm on my computer now. I have like 25 or 30 tabs that I opened up just searching for some of these terms in the text, and I could have done many more if I was going down the rabbit hole to any degree, because the book is so thoroughly researched and so in depth about this time period in Persian history. So it's the story of Khosrau the second, Khosrau Parviz, sort of from his not quite from his childhood, but from a young age, and he it's difficult to describe because Jahn's writing style is it's not quite free association, but it's close. It's damn close. And Jahn sort of does not write linearly. His purpose, and if you watch the first review again, he was interested in these sort of harmonic resonances and had some very interesting and sort of strange religious beliefs, and tried to instantiate them in his writing in certain ways. And you get the sense that he's not writing to convey information per se or to convey a storyline. Of course, as I've already been talking about, there's an insane amount of information in this story, but he's writing to create a sort of experience in the reader. I hate when people say stuff like, I felt hypnotized reading this, or I felt lulled in a certain way when I was reading this text. But I think that is something that Jahn, specifically as a writer, set out explicitly intending to do in what he was writing. And there's a certain sort of bizarre rhythm to a lot of what he writes, and I think that is consonant with what I understand about his personal beliefs, his personal sort of religious beliefs. Okay, so there's the first few pages of the story are basically historical background. They're testimonies from various historians of the Middle East, old sort of Persian historians. These are some of the names that I was not able to verify, but that's, who knows. And that sort of goes on for a few pages, and then we are introduced to Khosrau, who essentially is kicked out of power, or he becomes king at a young age, I think around 13 or so, and he's kicked out of power by one of the leaders of a noble family in his kingdom, the Mihrans. He eventually is able to regain power with the help of the emperor of a sort of neighboring empire, and it is heavily implied that the neighboring emperor and Khosrau have a homosexual relationship. They are very close, and Khosrau recalls later on in the story various encounters that they had, physical encounters, not explicitly sexual, but you know, heavy petting, maybe we could say. Uh, this emperor's name was Mauricios, who I think in the English translation now we just call Maurice, if I'm not mistaken. I know that sounds bizarre, but I was doing a little some digging on this, and I think that the accepted way of talking about this real person now is just to call him Maurice. Um, so the story is uh, goes from there, and there's another invading emperor that invades later on. Again, it's sort of non-linear. You don't necessarily get a good sense for the timelines for any of this, because it jumps back and forth from Khosrau sort of later in his life, looking back and specifically considering the building of a monument to himself and his dead horse, and one of his concubines, essentially one of his many women who had fathered children for him that he was particularly fond of. And there are all these carvings in the side of this holy mountain, and he's sort of contemplating them later on in the story. And then the story also goes further into the future from that. So again, it's really not linearly told, not linearly described. And so if my description of it sounds a little jumbled, it's because that's the way it's written. So Mauricios helps Khosrau back into power. That Khosrau's kingdom is then invaded again by a guy named Phocas, Phocas, and Phocas is, I believe, a sort of Byzantine emperor. I don't think he's a Christian, though the Christians do make appearances in the story later. And Phocas. Okay, wait, here, I think, so what happens is Phocas, it leads a rebellion against Mauricios, overthrows Mauricios, and kills him. And then Khosrau, to avenge Mauricios, wages war against Phocas. And that's the rest. That's basically the rest of the sort of story. Is the story of kind of the war between Khosrau and Phocas. They talk about Khosrau's people sort of running roughshod over Phocas's empire, and sort of raping and pillaging, classic sort of ancient wartime details. And then Khosrau is sort of in power, and he has collected. There's a list of these 12 incomparable treasures that he collects, and he's sort of resting on the throne while sort of variously waging wars and battles. And it's sort of the last part of the book is sort of him working to build this monument to his dead horse and one of his lovers after the war is over, after the battles are over. Ultimately, he when he decides to abdicate the throne because his people are dissatisfied because the wars and the fighting has been going on for too long, he abdicates the throne, and he chooses the son of this concubine. Her name is Shirin in the story, and I don't believe her son gets a name. The one that he chooses for the throne after he steps down. But some of his other sons are not happy about this, and specifically one named Shiro, I'm not sure, Sheroe, essentially takes it upon himself to take back power from Shirin's son. And he successfully does, and he holds a trial for Khosrau and Shirin's son, finds them guilty, and then has Shirin executed. Butchered is the term Jahnn uses, in front of Khosrau, and then has Khosrau killed with a spear. And that's kind of the end of the story. It's a sort of non-linear historical fiction, I guess, is the best way to put it. And it's deeply bizarre. There's no other way that I can think to put it. Um Kabad Kenya, the first story, was a bizarre story, but it at least had some recognizable characteristics of kind of fable and repetition. There are some very bizarre moments. There is some repetition in this, and it does have some of that um, kind of lore, certainly like occult, like storytelling. It's very Borgesian, I would say, with all of the names and the references and the dates. But of course, they're all real, but it reads in a very surreal way, a very non-real way. Um, so it's I would say even less linear, even less narrative than the first story, Kabad Kenya. Um, and it's I think both the tale of uh a king's reckoning with power, but even more specifically, I think it's a tale of sexuality because as I mentioned in the first review, um, Jahnn was a well-known bisexual. He was married with children, but also had a long, ongoing relationship with one of his schoolmates that he met when he was very young. And he was also deeply religious for a time in his life before sort of renouncing it and kind of moving into the realm of the occult and sort of these strange rituals. He developed something akin to a religion of his own and started a group around that, the Ugrino Society, which I discuss in greater detail in the first review. But the story is also, to me, a story of bisexuality. Frankly, it's a story about him sort of wanting to memorialize his love for his concubine, for Shirin, in this mountain carving. It's a series of mountain carvings, really, that he sort of commissions. And then the sculptor also kind of falls in love with Shirin while she's still alive, and there's some drama with that because he essentially becomes jealous because he's fat and old at the time, by the time he's commissioning this sculpture, and then tricks the sculptor into killing himself, basically, by telling him that Shirin is dead, and because he knew he loved Shirin, the sculptor, and the sculptor throws himself off of a cliff in despair. So there's that aspect, him memorializing his relationship with Shirin in this sculpture that he's commissioning, while at the same time memorializing his relationship with Mauritius through these wars that he's waging to avenge him. And I think that there's that duality in the sort of plot of the story, the same way that it was in Jahn's life, with his relationships with his wife and with his childhood friend, the names of whom are escaping me at the moment. I'm going to read a few passages to just sort of give you a sense of how strangely this story is written, and maybe to justify my inability to describe it clearly. So this is him sort of talking about Shirin and Shirin's son, and his sort of thought process around choosing this child to take the throne once he abandons it, and him considering this idea of building this sort of sculpture to them. The name of his dream is Shirin. Shirin has given birth to a son. He is not the oldest son. He is the son that the king loves. Because he loves Shirin. It is not Farhad's son. Farhad was the sculptor who Khosrau tricked into killing himself. Farhad is dead. Shabadiz is dead. Shabadiz is the mare, the cherished mare, the horse. Mauritius is dead. Phocas, son of a she-dog, son of 70 fathers, murdered, dead. The gold coins mounted up in his treasuries, round coins, dead fortune. He did not realize it was dead. He had it woven into silk. Happy hours, dead happy hours. He did not know. The women playing violins knew it. They were coins. They ran through his hand Then they rested like the gold in his treasury. And if they were blessed, they became pregnant, likewise became round, coins. Words could be written in the roundness of the disk, words by which Khosrau could distinguish them and recall the occasion on which he had seen them for the first or last time. Peacocks, boars' heads, flowers, stones, herons, rams, suns, stars, clouds. There were any a number of them. For them he wrote in their presence with effort in a language of wordless magnificence from the memories of his passion. His mind sought confirmation, rained down bolts of ardent creative fervor onto matter. He further corroborated comparisons with the animals in the field and the animals of dreams through the sweat of his quest. He brought both the real and the unreal to blaze up in cataracts of fiery colors, topics malleable as gold. Elaborated laws for the growth of plants from within, like a god inside the seed pod. Intertwined into lozenges, they were compelled to form ornaments and then congeal into their foliage and latticework and frame the animals of the fields, the winged sheep, the clawed horses, the proud and ruffled birds. His plans were carried out by dexterous weavers. The idea rampaged across the stone. The stone began to bud, to blossom. And I think that hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense. I'll probably read a few more passages, but it's beautiful writing, but it's also very strange writing. It's very, as I say, nonlinear, very metaphorical. And I think it's interesting that there's so much imagery. Even in that section that I read about budding and blossoming, there's a lot of detailed descriptions of plants in other areas. And there's a lot of imagery of fertility, I would argue, in a story that a big part of it is about a homosexual relationship, a relationship between two men, which if we take the classical metaphors of fertility as being distinctly feminine, I think is an interesting choice on Jahn's part. Okay, a couple other pieces that I want to read. Let's see. Okay. This is describing kind of the moment where he realizes that Farhad, the sculptor, is in love with Shirin, and he becomes jealous and kind of makes the determination to try to end their relationship. He starts to carve the mountain. Khosrau, who has no eye for this, who cannot judge the force required, is seized by restlessness. A report reaches him. Farhad has covered half the distance through the rock. The king is no hero. He can gather treasures, amass money. He is like a bull in his siring. No hero. His generals are heroes. The sculptor is one. The man on the throne enjoys pleasure. He is fat. Farhad, slender and wiry. Khosrau feels his heart. He looks round for familiar faces. He is abandoned. King. Maurikios had caressed his nipples when he was still without power. He believed in the other's love for Shirin, but not in his own. He sends a messenger to Farhad. The messenger tells him Shirin is dead. It is a lie from the mouth of the king. Farhad hurls himself from the cliff. The king's peace of mind is dashed. He begins to treat his own love for Shirin like a dogma. Dangers gather. He does not know their names. It is announced that the plague has penetrated the borders of his realm. He has extra guards placed on Labartu in the treasury. Labartu is a goddess, an ancient Armenian goddess of plague, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. Again, there were so many names and figures and sort of occult, mythological, religious figures throughout this book that I'm getting them confused. But Lagartu, I forget her place of origin, but she is some sort of goddess of plague, basically. Dangers gather. He does not know their names. It is announced that the plague has penetrated the borders of his realm. He has extra guards placed on Labartu in the treasury, but comets chase across the skies, and he knows neither their names nor their paths. Shabdiz is dead. She defecated in death. The generals win. Khosrau's victory is minor, unheroic. He hunts. Deer, boar, ducks. The women watch on. Even animals have blood in them, but they do not scream. Silent pain, so they have no feeling. He believes this, because he can scream. Their entrails are not Khosrau's entrails. He believes this, because he has yet to see himself from inside. He will learn. Their siring is not his siring. Their progeny is not his progeny. He will learn. Martyred game, martyred king. Again, I think hopefully I didn't have any particular reason to read that passage other than although it is interesting that later on in the story he's talking about hunting there and sort of seeing the entrails of these animals and their progeny not being his progeny, and of course later in the story Shirin and his son, who he had chosen to take over the throne, is tried, convicted, and disemboweled, among other things. So I don't know exactly what to make of this. There's one very short line that I want to read towards the end. I won't read the entirety of the ending, but this is sort of after Khosrau is dead, after Shirin's son is dead, and then it sort of runs through this sort of list of other historical figures that were involved, going back to the sort of beginning of the story, which again is basically reports from various historians about this time period. And again, I don't know about the veracity of those. Okay. They set up a butcher's block close by before the eyes of the former king, now clapped in irons, and placed upon it alive, naked, bound, as was Met, the son of Shirin, likewise former king, usurper, as they said, and criminal, and began to carve him up before his father's eyes, beginning with the belly. They eviscerated him, cut out the dying son's heart, castrated him, removed his brain, his tongue, his lungs, his kidney, and blinded him. O Lamb of God, innocent! With a bestial, infernal gesture, Labartu's fever burst from Khosrau's veins as festering ulcers. Tormented game, seven-petaled lotus blossom, grotto of paradise, blossoming pillars, spirals of acanthus. The king never learned of Shirin's fate. Whore in strangers' beds, for his ears refused to register sound. A few hours after his favorite son was slaughtered, he was put to the spear, like his father, and began to putrefy like his son, like Farhad and Shabdiz had, first of all, as Shirin would do someday. Shiroe was poisoned or died of the plague. General Shahrabaz, also king for 4 weeks, regent, then murdered. Boran, Khosrau's daughter, regent, died. Ardashir III, a child, the flood carried him away. The Catholic Church celebrated the feast of Exaltatio Sancte Crucis, O Lamb of God, innocently slain on the shaft of the cross. The soul of man has eternal life. The soul of the animal rots like the body of the animal and can be eaten like the body of the animal. So I think there you see kind of some of Jahnn's interest in this sort of ritualistic sort of interest in fertility and birth and the body and obviously death. I talk a lot more in the other review about Jahn's background with death specifically, and how he was sort of haunted by the death of his brother as a young child, and that stuck with him through his life. And I think that a lot of these themes already I'm seeing in these first 2 stories are becoming very consistent. Even if the style is a little different, this one was much more, at least at the beginning, it became a little bit more like Kabad Kenya later on, but at the beginning it was much more clinical, much more academic, much more sort of still strange and still bizarre in many ways, but much more structured. Again, I was thinking Borges for the first few pages of this story, because I think there's a similar vibe there. Anyway, that's roughly what I have to say about this. I'm looking forward to reading the next story, which I may put up here, or I may put on. I think I'll probably put the next review up here, and then I will put the review of the novella, The Night of Lead, up on the Patreon. So if you're liking this, give it a thumbs up, give us a subscribe. We put all of our podcast episodes up here, and as I said, we're going to be putting up more videos like this in the coming weeks and days. And if you really like it, go check out the Patreon. There's a lot of fun shit over there. We're going to be doing, bonus reviews, short stories, nonfiction, essays, that sort of thing. We're going to be doing top 10 lists. We're going to be doing private Zoom chats with all of us, or any of us. And there's some fun stuff over there if you are into the show, into what we're doing. And I really appreciate it. I will be back. Someone will be back. See ya.